You wanted real talk, and this is where you'll hear it. Uninhibited by the toxic influences of cancel culture, unvarnished and unfettered, unencumbered by the censorship of traditional radio, uncontaminated by big media interests.
And now, Sherman Unlimited.
Hi, it's Peter Sherman, and welcome to another episode of Sherman Unlimited. Canada has been around for over 150 years, not long on a world scale, but in that time we fought in a couple of world wars, taken on and defeated Quebec separation, and had a few nasty situations to deal with. But our ability to hold things together has never been imperiled. No outsider has tried to impose a way of life or seized our territory. Try living in Ukraine. That's not been easy, nor peaceful, for very long before someone has come along and threatened that, or worse. It has taken me a while to process everything I've heard, seen, and read into some kind of coherent thought where the current war in Ukraine is concerned. Most Western pundits just say that Vladimir Putin is a thug, a son of a bitch, and a war criminal, and leave it at that. I'm no fan of that guy either, so I won't dispute the characterizations. It's hard to generate any simpatico for a pig with an army who tells his soldiers to fire indiscriminately, killing moms and their babies and simply laying waste to anything in their path. That said, and to prove my point, I decided to revisit the history of Ukraine and other countries that made up the Soviet Union until it fell apart in 1991. Some of this is a bit hard to follow, although I've dramatically simplified it. But sketching out the political background of Ukraine may help in your or our understanding of what the hell is going on there and why. Bear with me, and wait for the conclusions I draw too. Ukraine was integral to the Soviet Union and has remained important to the Russian Federation, which shares a border where West meets East. Ukraine first declared itself an independent country when the Bolsheviks, or communists, invaded in 1917. World War I had ended, and Ukraine found itself being partitioned between Poland on the west and Bolshevik Russia to the east. The Bolshevik section became part of a communist Russia and was run as a puppet state of the Communist Party and known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It joined three other entities: the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Republic, and the Soviet Union, or USSR, was formed. That was in 1922, which remained in charge despite clear signs that many Ukrainians didn't care for the arrangement. Ukrainians are fiercely independent and proud, as you can see on your television screens every day. The first major recorded event in world history involving Ukraine was in 1932-1933 and is known as the Holodomor. While being the subject of some debate, the Holodomor is generally attributed to Joseph Stalin depriving Ukrainians of food and starving approximately 10 million people to death. Was that a peacetime genocide or just a happenstance resulting from a time dominated by the push for Soviet industrialization? I've read enough about the Holodomor to have concluded that this was Joseph Stalin's work, designed to show the independence-minded Ukrainians who was in charge. It was a genocide. I raised the issue of that tragic event by way of underlining the strong and long-held Ukrainian belief in self and their country, much like today. These are tough people, and the land they live on is rich in exceptional agricultural land and resources. When Germany attacked Russia in World War II, Ukrainians were split. Many Ukrainians saw the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. Others formed an anti-German partisan movement, and still other Ukrainians formed their own Ukrainian insurgent army and fought both the Soviets and the Nazis. Doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? Talk about being confused. But Ukrainian spirit and their drive towards independence had resiliency. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine became an independent state. A referendum confirmed that to be the will of the people. The European Union began to enlarge around 2004. Ukraine again faced options, some not wanted, others more desirable. The reason is because of its strategic location. On the one hand, the EU was on its doorstep. But on the other side, the Russian Federation still held sway on the eastern flank. The eastern portion of Ukraine was largely Russian in language and orientation, but western Ukraine felt pro-European. That caused political turmoil, but it culminated in 2014 when the Crimean crisis occurred, and Crimea to the south fell under the control of the Russian Federation and Putin. Interestingly, the independence of Ukraine was first recognized on December 2nd, 1991 by two countries, Poland and Canada. By 1996, Ukraine had sent all of its nuclear weapons back to Russia, and it became non-nuclear as a nation. The old Soviet Union had placed many missiles and atomic warheads in Ukraine. After all, it was closer to Western Europe and the NATO alliance countries. Meanwhile, Ukraine created and adopted its own constitution on the 28th of June, 1996. Yes, it's actually all modern history. In 2004, then-President Leonid Kuchma announced he'd not run for re-election. There were two candidates. The pro-Russian candidate was Viktor Yanukovych, the incumbent prime minister who had the support of both the outgoing president and the Russian Federation. The main opposition candidate, and you're going to remember him, was Viktor Yushchenko, who was looking westward and expressing the desire for Ukraine to join the EU. Yanukovych prevailed very narrowly, but supporters of opponent Yushchenko cried foul. Here's why you'll remember him. He's the guy who was poisoned by sources unknown but largely suspected of being the Russian Federation. He was a great-looking guy. Why is that important? Because he survived the poisoning attempt but was left with a very pockmarked face. There were street demonstrations by those protesting the rigging of the election, and the nation's Supreme Court nullified it and ordered a second runoff election in which Viktor Yushchenko won. Yushchenko had no easy time of it and went from crisis to crisis as pro-Russian groups formed to support the re-establishment of a Yanukovych government. Yushchenko dissolved the rising opposition movement and even went as far as dismissing 3 of 18 constitutional court judges, accusing them of corruption. Relations with the Russian Federation then deteriorated as Yushchenko moved closer to the EU and the Western orbit. In 2010, a presidential election was held, a three-way race. Guess who returned to office? Right, the Russian-oriented Viktor Yanukovych, who refused to sign an agreement initiated by his predecessor that would have put Ukraine into the European Union. Yanukovych, remember, was pro-Russian. Street violence ensued again. A variety of political maneuvers followed, and in 2014, ultimately the pro-Russian Yanukovych fled Kyiv. In mid-2014, a scant 8 years ago, Petro Poroshenko won decisively and became president. He inherited a mess, economically and politically. Later in the same month, a unilateral one-week truce was declared and an ultimatum issued to pro-Russian mercenaries and local militants to get out of Ukraine. The liberation of Ukraine supposedly began, but by then, the Russian Federation was engaging in armed aggression, which we will all recall. Western countries assisted, and the line of demarcation did hold. Poroshenko signed the economic part of the Ukraine-EU Association Agreement in late June of 2014. Poroshenko hung on to power, but in parliamentary elections in fall of 2014, a variety of parties won seats, with none coming even close to a majority, but no communists. Poroshenko began dismantling Ukraine's totalitarian legacy, but could it hold? The government worked to improve the Ukrainian armed forces, but individuals with power remained, and that effort, while scoring some success, was an uphill climb. Meanwhile, currency fell due to depletion of gold reserves and a concurrent drop of 6% in GDP and a 24% inflation rate. In 2016, a further agreement was signed with the EU, granting Ukrainians access to the so-called Schengen countries of the EU, which allowed free travel without passports. The International Monetary Fund intervened. Tough fiscal measures were introduced, and Ukraine's economic situation was stabilized. By 2019, and with a lot of cleansing of entrenched pro-Russian officials, and with several military encounters under its belt, the Constitution of Ukraine was amended. It said that the country would join the EU formally as well as enter NATO. Poroshenko moved Ukraine a very long way politically economically and militarily. He even got involved in the business of an independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine. While Ukrainians were still not wholly united, there is no doubt Poroshenko left his mark on those 5 years, and you can bet that by then Vladimir Putin was one pissed-off Russian, and his plans were by then underway for what we're seeing now. Putin was having none of Ukraine's NATO and EU aspirations on his western border. In April of 2019, in the second round of a presidential election, actor and showman Volodymyr Zelensky became president. Finally, a name you know. He used his charismatic personality to truly and finally consolidate the protest mood across the political spectrum, and his share of the vote topped 73%. The Servant of the People Party won an absolute majority in the parliamentary elections, and in mid-2020, Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania created the Lublin Triangle Initiative to further a trilateral cooperative agreement and to further Ukraine's push for EU and NATO acceptance. In early 2021, a presidential decree banned pro-Russian television channels from Ukraine. In mid-2021, the association trio was formed between foreign ministers of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. They wanted to be part of the EU too. Just last month, Ukraine applied formally to join. Finally, a united Ukraine had cast the die and was throwing in with the West. But as mentioned, Putin was never going to go along, and here we are. End of history lesson. And what a lesson it is. And I say that as it continues to be written daily. It shows that Ukraine, through its people, has always been fiercely independent and mostly aspirationally like us. The cost for those aspirations in blood and treasure has been steep, and now more than ever because Russia has decided that all of the puppetry in which it is engaged, the rigging of elections, the use of spycraft and dirty tricks, none of them have succeeded. What's next is what's now. But it begs the question, why not just say, the hell with it? Well, the guy on the other end of this, remember, is Vladimir Putin, and that's not his style. He wants to win, and he usually gets what he wants, regardless of what or who stands in the way. He doesn't flinch from reminding the world that he has plenty of nukes, and we all assume he'd not shy away from using them, which must never happen. It might solve his Ukraine problems, but world annihilation just doesn't sit well with anybody, to put it mildly. However, with absolutely no sympathy for his position, let me offer some conjecture about his mindset, and yes, his mistrust and paranoia about Western objectives. Putin was a big guy when the USSR was still a force in the world. He was a master spy, and he ran the KGB, Russia's infamous espionage and dark arts department. You can be sure that Putin knows how to be a master puppeteer and also a magician. He knows more than one way to make people disappear and how to foment discord on an international basis. And the fact he's a megalomaniac doesn't help either. Anyway, let's think for a moment about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I talked about it on the last episode of Sherman Unlimited several weeks ago. President Kennedy was faced with the prospect of Soviet missiles aimed at the United States becoming a permanent fixture of the Cuban landscape. Barely 100 miles from the United States east coast, the trip for those missiles would be pretty short if ever used against the U.S. Kennedy said no. He blockaded Cuba at sea, not allowing shipping into or out of Cuba. He told the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that the missiles were not getting into Cuba and the ones already there were to be removed and the missile sites destroyed. People were by that point getting prepared for a nuclear war. But Mr. Khrushchev blinked. He did as he was told and complied with Kennedy's demands. He knew that if he pushed a nuclear button and unleashed hell on the United States of America, double hell would wreak havoc on all Soviet territory. Nobody can win a war like that. I raise it because my thinking is that the threat President Kennedy perceived because of those Soviet missiles in close proximity is likely similar to what Putin must feel at the prospect of his neighbor Ukraine being part of the EU, or worse yet, NATO, an organization whose very existence was to keep the West safe from the East many, many years ago. He can envision missiles 100 miles away aimed at his country, and he won't allow it. I can understand that. But the world has changed, even if Vladimir Putin hasn't. Nobody is interested in taking out Russia. Tensions have only been aggravated by Putin's war, the indiscriminate bombing of everything, and the forced evacuation of citizens make for less of a threat. At least that's what I suppose he is feeling. Ukraine, after all, is the last vestige of a security ring around Mother Russia. How it all looks to the rest of the world is of no concern to Vladimir Putin. And what is NATO to Putin in 2022? Well, NATO began as an alliance of similarly minded nations determined to stand together against an enemy. And they made it clear that an attack on one would be considered as an attack on all. In response, back in the day, the Soviet bloc came up with something similar called the Warsaw Pact, but that doesn't exist anymore. The original NATO consisted of only 12 countries: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Most of them were pretty far away from Putin territory. What does NATO look like today? Not 12 countries anymore. Now 30. Among the current members are the former East Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Romania, among others. Most of them, as you can see, were part of the Warsaw Pact when they were Soviet states. Can you see why Putin drew the line at Ukraine joining NATO as it wishes to do? And can Putin's positioning and actions not clearly demonstrate why NATO is pretty much the choice of Eastern Bloc countries not far from Russia? I am in no way justifying any of what's going on or Putin's motivations. Furthermore, I believe in independent countries doing as they alone see fit. Sadly, the world doesn't work that way. And given some of the threats made by Putin during this terrible war regarding any assistance offered Ukraine by NATO, we are all pawns in a dangerous game of chess. Many leaders of powerful countries have tried to intervene with Putin. So far, to no avail. But ultimately, Russia cannot hope to finish Ukraine off and occupy it. The spirit of Ukrainians is just too strong. I must believe that there will be a point where there's been sufficient death and destruction that Vladimir Putin will sit down with serious people and make a serious deal. One that guarantees his country's safety, but forces him to guarantee that of others. I do not care to speculate on the alternatives. I'm Peter Sherman.
Sherman Unlimited.
Let Peter know what's on your mind. Drop him an email. info@petersherman.com.
Find future episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts. So if you like what you heard, tell a friend. If you really liked it, tell 3 friends. If you really hated it, tell 3 enemies. We'll talk again soon.